So thank you. Are we going live? Okay. So thank you so much for joining us for today's talk. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robin McDowell, who is an assistant professor in African American Studies. Her research explores the historical dimensions of environmental racism and visions for environmental justice for Black communities. Her current book, Swamp Capitalism: The Roots of Environmental Racism, is a history of bonds between race and the environment on a geologic timescale. Her transdisciplinary research methodology draws on archives, oral histories, earth sciences, graphic design, and multimedia art making, which I think we'll see some of today. She holds a PhD in African and African American Studies, an MA in History from Harvard University, an MFA in Design from the University of Texas at Austin, and a BA in Fine Arts from the University of Pennsylvania. So thank you so much, Dr. McDowell, for joining us today, and we're so excited to have you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. And okay, so I'm gonna use this voice. So can you all hear in the back? Okay, so if you can't, just wave at me and I will belly project.
Can you just use the microphone, please? The microphone is on. We're having
This
some
one?
issues with it.
Do you want me? I can just. Should I try holding this?
Okay.
Oh, is this better? Ooh. All right, I'm gonna try it. I'll do these two together and I'll sit over here. Okay, thank you so much for that incredible introduction. And I am honored and excited to be here today as we gather on the unceded lands of the Ohlone Confederacy. I'd also like to thank the Living Earth Collaborative and the Evolution, Ecology, and Population Biology Group for their invitation and support, and all the folks who coordinated this hybrid event. Hello too to our viewers on Zoom and YouTube. And I also want to express my gratitude to Jonathan Lassos, Ken Olson, Liz Carlin, and Vincent Antonio Brazelton for being the people who first welcomed me into this wonderful world of WashU biology almost 2 years ago. Thank you. All right, so. No, all right, sorry about this. There you go. Okay, so I want to start our time together with these jars. And actually, I guess you all are going to start me off because without me giving you more context, I'm interested in what you think these are. And we can riff and what words and phrases come to mind, and you can call them out, no judgment, just collecting. You want me to put some? Sure. There we go. Words, phrases, what do you think is in there? Good. Soil. Yeah. What? Organic matter. Oh, okay. Okay.
Gravel.
Gravel. All righty, let's do two more. Land. We'll revisit that at the end again. So I'm going to give you a little more context now and keep building upon it to tell you what I see in these jars. In August of 2019, I visited the site of the Nelson Coleman Correctional Center in Kelowna, Louisiana, to take a soil sample. I watched two St. Charles Parish police officers approach from a distance and knew that if I stayed put, there would be questions. Ma'am, is everything okay? Ma'am, are you lost? Do you need help with directions? And they looked concerned. I was crouched in a wet culvert, digging in the ground with a kitchen spoon. The actual answer to this question was, well, I need this mud in the drainage ditch to send to a soil testing lab to figure out if this was an infilled sugar plantation. and what kinds of sugarcane varieties might still grow here. Because that tells me something about why there is currently a warehouse for human beings here, and to envision this place in the 18th and 19th centuries. The idea was not to translate or interpret this data in the way that life sciences experts might, but to look at it as a way of knowing, of understanding the feeling of a place. As I stand at a particular site, I wonder, were enslaved people living on the same land today? What kinds of crops would grow near the slave quarters? Is that still low-lying land? Has the soil been exhausted by sugarcane growing? But instead of that answer, I smiled and I told them that I had pulled over to take an important phone call because safety first. My phone was nowhere to be seen, and I was at least 100 feet away from my parked car. That's a good idea. They offered to help me get back to the highway again when I finished with my call, and I assured them that it wasn't necessary. Well, have a great day and stay safe. Let us know if we can help with directions. And I got back in my car, clutching the bag of dirt. So I think that in this jar of soil, or these jars of soil, is the story of a town known as Kelowna, Louisiana, that sits on a 2.5 million year old landform in today's Southeast Louisiana. This story sheds light on why I was offered assistance, though not without its own set of racialized and gendered constructs, and others were locked inside. Why is the prison in a swamp? Why the heck would I even be there in the first place? Well, Kelowna is in a region of Southeast Louisiana known as Cancer Alley, which is the corridor along the Mississippi River from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, where for almost 15 years, I've driven the back roads and the wetlands, visiting community elders, friends, and colleagues in neighborhoods eclipsed by oil refineries, entire towns bought out and relocated by plastics companies, on land stolen by Shell Oil, near cemeteries and churches plowed under by the US military, and chemical plants that leach heavy metals into the groundwater. Families descended from enslaved people who worked the land for generations before are consolidated into a few streets. Children fall mysteriously ill, only to receive news that there are synthetic chemicals in their bloodstreams. These are not just observations or case studies. These are people who I have watched grow up and grow old. So in a way, it makes sense that some would say that what I'm doing is writing a history of environmental racism, because without a doubt, Cancer Alley is an example of environmental racism in some of its most extreme forms. But I'm also conjuring something more capacious than environmental racism, as the term is currently and widely understood and defined by Dr. Robert Bullard, known as the father of environmental justice, as any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages individuals, groups, or communities based on race. What I want to share is something closer, often fragmented, things missed. A dear friend of mine who was raised there says, "My hands are in it, picking it up and slipping through. You can't hold it all, but you still need to examine it." So in addition to, as I understand, over 100,000 different types of living organisms in the soil. Is this true? Maybe we can talk more afterward. I believe that the material world collects psychic energy. Materials like soil and water are chemical compounds, objects in space, parts of a cultural milieu, and sites of individual and community memory. Personal encounters at these sites, such as the one I told you about, belie thousands of years of unseen energy of a racist violence. So let's go back to our site so I can lead you through this idea. This is Kelowna, Louisiana, in St. Charles Parish or County. Locals say the name Kelowna comes from an erroneous translation and mispronunciation of the Choctaw word for falling leaves. Kelowna has a total population of 813 people, with 94.4% identifying as African American, and the township is only 9 square miles. There are 3 salient features in the area: a power plant, Waterford 3 nuclear generating station, a prison, Nelson Coleman Correctional Center, where I was before, and a port, the site of a future oil shipping terminal. Archaeological studies date this region to the Pleistocene epoch, about 2 to 2.5 million years ago. Also, please feel free to correct me. Characterized by traces of early human life. A petrified cypress swamp was found in the Kelowna area in the 1990s, actually by Tristram Kidder, one of our anthropology professors here made that discovery. And a Baigula and Kinapissa village have been identified, as well as evidence of a Washita settlement. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, the arrival of European colonists is more well documented. In 1721, German commander Karl Friedrich D'Arensberg arrived in present-day Kelowna with a land grant from the King of France and a band of colonists. He founded the town of Carlstein. These land grants were property deeds and trade agreements in one, issued by monarchs and their financiers. Surveyors manufactured linear environmental boundaries that would set the terms of the grants. The settlers, and particularly the D'Arensbergs, being the wealthiest and most powerful family, enslaved indigenous along with African people for their households and to expand their farms. To do so, colonists attempted to impose boundaries that kept people out and hemmed them in. The land grant boundaries set the terms for racialized labor. Enslaved Africans cleared and cultivated stolen land, creating a category of indigenous trespassers, yet were themselves considered property of white people. When the men were out of the house, white women would post up in the treetops along the riverbank, and they would fire off guns to warn the men if they spotted an indigenous intruder. This slide shows 2 different 18th century land grants, one of which is for a property just south of Carlstein. And notice a few notations here: cypress, meadow, and land considered royal property. These green overlays are designated a swamp or labeled vacant, which we know was in no way devoid of life forms, but considered uninhabitable by settlers or mysteriously populated by indigenous peoples, making an enemy of land, water, and human beings. Here is another grant with the word vacant zoomed in, and that might be easier to see. Right. So in practice, however, right, the idea of a boundary with enslaved Africans inside the fence and indigenous people outside did not hold, but violence powered the entire enterprise. So for example, white men held indigenous and black. Is this? Oh, I think so, maybe. Oh. All right, I'll keep going. Held indigenous and black women in forced concubinage. And it wasn't rare that enslaved African American, and indigenous peoples worked side by side. Some indigenous peoples traded both with and for enslaved Africans and African Americans. Free and enslaved Africans and indigenous people built families and kinship networks and fled to the swamps, forming maroon communities, which is the course that you can take with my colleague, Karma Frierson, sitting in the back. I'm sorry, I had to. So environmental proximities could blur racial categories, yet were physically inscribed by the labor of African descended people. So What was being cultivated by the labor of enslaved people on this cleared land? For most of the 18th century, the colonists were charged with growing food for New Orleans as part of their land grant agreement. If New Orleans suffered a period of hardship, such as flooding or disease, the French monarchy would send more enslaved Africans to this area to increase food production. At this point, Karlstein were growing various fruits, rice, other garden vegetables, along with milk and cheeses. As for larger scale commercial crops, at first, the colonists tried their hand at growing tobacco and then indigo and found it unsustainable. At the turn of the 18th century, however, agriculture turned successfully and was dominated by sugarcane, particularly after the Haitian Revolution in 1791 to 1804, in which planters fled the island of Haiti to Louisiana territory, forcing enslaved people along with them, bringing new varieties of sugarcane and scientific knowledge. The closing of the transatlantic slave trade followed in 1808, coupled with increased US taxes on imported sugar. So sugar from Caribbean plantations began to take up less space on the domestic market. As such, this Louisiana patchwork of land grants grew into the Sugar Bowl, Louisiana's crown jewel, some of the largest sugar plantations in North America. Derrensburg's holdings expanded by purchase and marriage and became Kelowna and Waterford plantations, the two largest in the area, outlined and shown there in green and yellow. As demand for Louisiana sugar rose, planters now needed more resources to meet these demands. They needed more wood to boil sugarcane juice into syrup and sugar crystals. They needed more lumber to sell, and actually a significant amount went to St. Louis. So if in your house or you see a house with 16-inch wide cypress planks, they are from Louisiana swamps, and you'll never get another 16-inch cypress plank again. So back to this. Lumber to also build more structures on their own property, to expand their hunting grounds, and to hand cut canals on the edges of the plantation to move sugarcane from their fields, now even further inland toward the river. They looked to the once mystical swamp, now directing enslaved people to harvest new resources for them in land they dared not venture. But as back swamps became deforested and cross-cut with canals, the trees and plants that once kept the soil and water in place were not there to serve this function. So these sugar fields were under watery siege on both sides. Before the Civil War, the federal government authorized the state of Louisiana to infill swamps and create new farmland. But by the end of the Civil War, Louisiana was broke. The state retained ownership of the land, but there was no money to infill it, let alone help planters, let alone provide for newly freed people. But after the Civil War, communities of formerly enslaved people forged ahead despite the odds, and especially in Louisiana. In 1866, Black families from several plantations, including Kelowna and Waterford, founded Freetown, an enclave carved out from a small parcel of land purchased collectively at the back of the plantations. They cultivated gardens full of fruits and vegetables that could survive in wet, low-lying areas. The swamp was being taken back. The former Freetown is one of the few residential areas still left in today's Kelowna, which brings me to the power plant. Because the past can never be completely left behind, because some members of this Black community were de facto enslaved on Waterford Plantation through the 1960s. In private interviews with genealogist Antoinette Harrell, community members, most of which who wish to remain anonymous, called the system peonage. They recall sleeping outside and eating crickets to survive. Most had nowhere to go or were too poor to leave. One mother described how her daughter would hide in the swamps every night to escape routine sexual assault and once tried to run away. So these people were working the sugarcane fields on the Waterford plantation site up to 1963, not 1863, 1963. When the Waterford family descendants sold the land to Louisiana Power and Light, an electric company, who then quickly sold to a corporation that delivers electricity to New Orleans. Lyle, what's it called? Entergy. And Entergy provides electricity to millions in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. And Entergy wasted no time in laying plans for a nuclear generator plant. So Black families were working those fields up until the sale. The land was not lying fallow, waiting for its next owner. Perhaps the crops many paid their lives for had even gone unharvested. Perhaps, and I believe, the psychic energy of the enslaved and formerly enslaved remained in the soil itself. This is an image of the Waterford sugar mill that was taken down, and land that had been made ready for sugar for centuries gave Entergy a head start in preparing the land. So the Waterford plants, 2 gas and 1 nuclear, were built between 1971, 1985. And prior to construction, archaeological and environmental studies were done. 2 structures were still standing, the overseer's house and a slave cabin. And they were recognized on the National Historic Register for their architectural value. The Environmental Protection Agency then calculated that some radioactive material would be released into the air and water drainage system, but that the amounts would be below the legal acceptable levels. So the excavation permit was issued to dig out the site, infill the land, and go nuclear. And I do take the point that nuclear power may, at this moment, be a clean, or maybe even the cleanest form of energy. But the plant prompts me to ask, what is the legal acceptable level of fear for people who for centuries have lived in a world in which the powerful control the crossroads of life and death for people of color through domination of the physical environment? In 2001, a helicopter pad was installed behind the Waterford nuclear plant. That's the pink dot with the arrow. It unearthed both 19th century and indigenous artifacts. The slave quarters and overseer's house had sunk into the wetlands, and the plantation bell that called enslaved people to work before sunrise and marked the end of the lunch break was found and donated to Entergy. They displayed it in front of their offices amongst the landscaping. This soil sample, one of the ones that says, I think it says plant or says Waterford, was taken from nearby. And lab results from the Louisiana State University Agriculture Extension showed that this area was upland soil. It had been infilled higher than water level, which for reasons we can discuss in more detail, is rare in Louisiana. So here we go again, 2001 helicopter pad year, 2001. Also, St. Charles Parish Sheriff's Department broke ground for the Nelson Coleman Correctional Center. The incarceration of an overwhelming majority of Black men on the edge of a former plantation shouldn't be lost on us. The prison then is also an extension of battles and anxieties over swampland. The prison opened its doors to much fanfare from Sheriff Greg Champagne. Side note here, this was the same sheriff who was sued for concealing records of dispatching law enforcement to Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota to assist in counterterrorism efforts against the water protectors in 2016. And the Sheriff Champagne said, gone are the days of delaying arrests on warrants or reconsidering arresting nonviolent offenders because of space issues. There are plenty of vacancies at the inn. The 2-story concrete prison had 590 beds. The previous site had about 100. where deputies would pack people inside the cells to sleep on the floor. As of February 12th, 2023, 70% of the incarceration is Black, and nearly all the beds are filled. According to the Sheriff's Office website, the incarcerated people save taxpayer and parish money by filling sandbags during hurricane season and picking up debris during storm recovery. At a press conference on September 1st, Sheriff Champagne said, "If you want to commit a crime, don't do it, because we might put you in a unit that doesn't have air conditioning, but we have space. There's room at the inn." The sample, I think that says Nelson Coleman, was taken nearby. It was the one in the picture in the ditch, and it's lowland. The area had not been as comprehensively excavated and infilled as the sites of Waterford were. At the time of the 2001 groundbreaking, though, the tracts of wetlands surrounding the prison parcel had already been sold to mineral prospecting companies, real estate developers, and Entergy. Entergy, the electric company that everyone in Louisiana pays. Okay. Over the course of the 1950s to the 1970s, exploratory oil wells had been drilled and abandoned on the prison property and surrounds. So today, the prison is surrounded by 3C Riverside Properties, a private equity company that does mineral exploration. And others include a company called the Louisiana Land and Exploration Company, which is an oil drilling company founded in the 19th century. And today, this same company also owns resorts, coastal industrial zones, and coal, gold, and copper mines in Hawaii, Australia, Canada, Indonesia, Kenya, Ethiopia, and the Netherlands. So these slides help to illustrate this layering, right? Showing indigenous settlement, and then Carlstein, then sugar plantations, active and abandoned oil wells, and the prison property in white. On the parish level, there are many, many more wells owned by some of the same mineral exploration companies. Which leads to the port. If so much of the parish was already owned by mineral companies and sat on the banks of the river, in the 1970s, a petition was circulated to turn the entirety of St. Charles Parish into a foreign trade zone, or FTZ. What is an FTZ? I'll lead you through this to the best that I can. Are there any economists in the room? All right, here we go. What is an FTZ? Why would people in St. Charles Parish want it? Foreign trade zones are areas in the United States where foreign and domestic merchandise is considered outside of the country, which means certain types of merchandise can be imported without paying import tax. And custom taxes are only due if the merchandise is shipped out of the FTZ for domestic consumption. If the merchandise is re-exported internationally, then no taxes are paid. And we were talking about that there's lots of oil refineries and wells. So what would happen is if you could bring crude oil into the FTZ, refine it, and then ship it and pay no taxes on any of it. So it makes it far easier and cheaper for refiners and petrochemical corporations to receive raw materials and make higher profits on international sale of finished products. So again, we have another situation with imposed geographic boundaries that determine what materials and people enter, exit, and expend labor within them. And then not by sheer coincidence, the headquarters is just upriver from a former sugar plantation. The planter's house was restored for visitor accommodations and business meetings. And today, this land is for sale. It is approved as an expansion of the Globalplex FTZ. And I think there's one of the jars says Globalplex, and that was taken from there. The results were upland soil. So these are dark stories for dark times. Bullets shot by white women in trees, falling like acid rain. Abandoned oil wells simmering somewhere in the swamp. Champagne's Inn, a slowly sinking vessel with a majority of Black men and women on board, floating on top of a sugar plantation, anxiously and violently carved out of stolen land in wetlands ravaged for oil. So why does this stuff matter? Students in my classes sometimes ask, and I'm glad they do because it keeps me accountable as a researcher and an educator. In terms of the work I presented, I think deeply about what it means to be a steward of precious stories of people and of the earth itself. I don't consider this as data to possess, but as shared knowledge sites. They're provocations to consider a broader concept of environmental racism that spreads across time and space and demands ways of knowing that exceed institutional structures. Black communities and communities of color are connected to one another by millions of years of forces beyond our reckoning. They also create a framework for how generations of Black folks in Kelowna, an archaeologist finding evidence of Indigenous communities, an environmental survey team whose findings get omitted from corporate reports, and interdisciplinary scholars might find common ground. And common ground is what we must find to survive in a time of environmental crisis unlike any we've seen in our lifetimes. As cities drown and forests burn, many are left bewildered and terrified. How did we get here? For many communities, these are long-standing conditions that require white suffering to be acknowledged as acute crises. The story of Kelowna raises questions of both economic and spiritual reparations and the intangible losses of violence and displacement. It also raises the question of multi-scalar biological reparations. What could it mean to repair, regenerate, or evolve with scars? And so this is where the pigment comes in, the last component. How can we find hope here, knowing all of this history? What if we imagined Black history as a geological and biological churning? Are there new creative and interpretive possibilities in organic materials and even the commodities themselves? And so it was that I came to the practice and medium of earth pigment making just before Louisiana went under COVID quarantine. I couldn't go see live music. So naturally then I collected soil along with water and plants. And I evaporated and I froze and I heated things in my driveway with proper safety gear, of course. And then I began to create watercolor pigments with the soil samples, unfiltered cane syrup that actually still has a picture of a plantation house on it. Metal shavings, rock salt, and botanicals grown by enslaved people in plantation gardens, such as collards and okra. The pieces themselves became sites of ongoing historical accretion. So as the pigments oxidized, crystallized, dissipated, and congealed, they rendered new visual, tactile, and interpretive possibilities. So I'm going to show you a few process image and then some finished pieces that I actually brought from the other sites. So here are some abstracted map overlays from some of my other research sites, similar to the ones I showed you. And here is the piece in progress. And here is the final mini-series. And I brought these in, the actual physical ones that we can take a look at after, actually. We should keep that was also definitive, but I'll keep them up here. So if you want to, you can come and take a look. And if you look closer, there's a lot of you can find a lot of different substances in here. Hydrocarbon combustion reaction with sugar, rock salts, what else? And a set of mineral spirits that were used to resist the color in the one with the white squares. So what kind of new configurations were happening on more granular scales? Could we call this a liberatory molecular process? So with my own studio practice though, this is only one of two possibilities of the pigment I'm working with these days. And the second, and perhaps most important, are community making pigment workshops. In New Orleans in December, primarily community members and students of color came together to create a series of pigments from materials of personal and family significance. And it was really beautiful for us to handle these beautiful paints in community and began to create new stories together by and with the people of Louisiana. A few shots from that really incredible day. Here's some of the poems that we created. And I've also brought this workshop to two classes here at WashU. And I have to show you these pictures to feature my brilliant creative students, a few of whom are in the audience, in which they worked with materials from their own lives, sharing these stories with their classmates and physically working together to create the pigment. So now I want to draw your attention back to the jars. Do you think that these are the same materials from 40-ish minutes ago? Would you use different words? Would the ones you already called out here take on more capacious meanings? I hope we can continue that conversation. To be absolutely honest with you all, this is my very first time giving a talk in a biology department. So for me then, today is one in which we found new ways to connect to each other, to a larger society, and to our environment. It is a constructive act, and I believe that what we have created is a space of hope.
Okay, since we're down to one microphone, I would ask that you speak your question loudly and then we'll have Robin repeat it so we can have the people online.
Yeah. Oh yeah, actually, can we do one thing first? Can we do words again? Okay. This is yours. Okay, who wants to add or change? Yes, you go ahead.
Histories. Stories. Poetry. Ooh. Labor. Ooh.
One more for our collection.
We don't have Earth.
Earth. Thank you for doing this. I'm gonna copy this down and think about it. I think it's lovely, right? That we went from very material to abstract to structures of feeling. So yeah, thank you for doing that with me. So I'm gonna hand this back and you're gonna just repeat the questions that they say. Oh, okay. Raise your hand. Okay. Yes, please.
So you know the space so well. You said there were 800 people there living in Wallace.
813.
Okay, so is there any improvement in healthcare or schooling? Or just healthcare and schooling is in New Orleans,
So yeah, there is healthcare and schooling out in the river parishes. Actually, so one of the interesting things is that a lot of the oil and petrochemical corporations sponsor school programming and playgrounds and sometimes even medical clinics, right? So on one hand, we want to say, yes, it's a yes and, right? Yes, and this is being paid for, supported by the people who are actually creating the health problems, right? So you kind of see improvements in these kind of tragic corporate cycles. Which in a way kind of keeps the cycle going through improvement and poisoning, I should also point out though, that what's incredible is the rise in public attention to the issues in Cancer Alley that for decades really were grassroots community organizers advocating for safety and health in their communities, trying to stop the permitting for some of these plants coming. And now I think there are national level lawsuits, and we've seen President Biden doing his post-Ida visit, but pay up, Uncle Joe. So I think right there, with that visibility that has come from the decades of grassroots organizing, advocacy for self-determination of these communities are starting to move the needle through some of these more legible forms of reparation. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes. Oh, over here and then back there.
Great. I love the historical aspect of this. Is very interesting. You didn't mention Katrina. I was wondering, what did this site look like in 2005?
Absolutely. So what's interesting, I can go back to that map, is that it's about 33 miles inland from Katrina, right? But it was actually, and this is the Waterford nuclear plants. It was one of the first times in history that they were shut down, right? And so there was definitely hurricane damage, but it wasn't to the extent of New Orleans where it was, directly connected to the coastal, I don't think storm surge. I'm sorry, but yes, absolutely, and it affected right on a large there. Oh. Where's the map? There you go. Okay. Oh, wait. No. So it's actually, yeah, quite more inland. So by the time the storm surge reached there, it's not destructive, right? Life, limb, and property were lost, but we weren't seeing the kind of images that we saw in New Orleans of the houses with only the roofs. Oh.
So this is the biology department, and it looks like that land was really very cool before all this happened. It looks like it's been completely trashed. Are there any natural areas left in the area you were working?
There are, but also this is so interesting. Okay, this is a whole other talk. Maybe it's a book. There is right next to this town, right there is a nature preserve called the St. Charles Parish Nature Preserve, and there is a children's park called the Wetland Watchers Park. And that was actually a deal between the governor, David Treen, and two oil companies. And it was a way to grandfather in mineral exploration grants from the 1900s, because if they created this nature preserve, then those leases could stay and it wouldn't become private land where people could kick and stuff. So, okay, wait. So I'm answering this on multiple valences, right? So we have these sort of named visible natural areas that are more, I think, designations, right, than actual spaces of biodiversity in a way. But also what we are seeing is a lot of the areas that have been washed out through flooding or through kind of industrial effluent are being, and I don't know if this is the right word, right, rewilded in a way, because they are actually of no interest to industry, right? So if land is kind of quickly sinking away, Shell Oil isn't going to build a refinery on it. And so therefore it's going to get kind of unownable. And there's also things going on where throughout for centuries, it's very unclear who owns the shoreline. And when the riverbank kind of falls into the river, people fight over ownership of it. And then what happens is just stagnation, in which there's actually an environment that's left on its own because it's considered economically unusable. So you see that happening. You also see that happening going back to New Orleans, a study in the lower 9th ward that's actually showing the incredible amounts of, I guess, new plant life and new animal life in a lot of the more what we've like the blighted areas of the lower ninth ward, that are actually maybe more rich than before the hurricane.
So Kelowna seems like a pretty random town for you to end up in. How'd you end up doing research here and working here?
Yes, so there's a town not too far away called Reveal Town. And then a town right across the river known as Norco. And I was doing work in those two places around plantation cemeteries that were resurfacing. And so I was kind of working, I guess, as an activist, organizer, public historian, to start building reparations cases around slave cemeteries that were emerging next to and underneath chemical refineries, right? And in doing so, you basically, when you're organizing, there isn't, right, an urban nexus, a metropole here. So you need to go into all of these places, talk to the people. And I think we had talked about this last year, which is really great, right? And when you talk about biological degradation, you can't say, okay, it's within the confines of Reveal Town. Okay, we're only going to look at the type of poisoning or health disparities that are going on in that bounded 9 square mile area. So when you're looking at these toxicity studies of who do you want at community meetings, who is going to come to the toxics march, you need to look at Cancer Alley in that corridor all as one. So Kelowna was also one of those places. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor McDowell. Really solid. I have a quick question about historical agency, but also I think speaks to. I'd love to hear more about cultural reparations as a community. But I was wondering, do the wetland ecosystem and the plants and animals who live there feature as historical agents, or are they passively settlers of these other corporate domination?
Awesome question. Thank you for asking. Are you familiar with John Barry? So he is a lawyer, and the case got pretty sensationalized in the New York Times magazine. I don't know if anyone saw that he launched a lawsuit on behalf of the animals that were affected by the BP oil spill, which kind of actually created this amazing precedent to do so, and won reparations from the oil companies that are now being used to potentially create river diversions and also parks. But that was done on behalf of like the plaintiff as an ecosystem in a much more capacious sense than just what is the human, our alternatives. So that's an example of something on the coast. But in terms of these towns further in, that has not yet been done. But there are some brilliant lawyers actually working with groups there here to be able to use historical evidence in cases to bring back the idea of if enslaved people lost farmland, how much of that how much would it cost to restore or rebuild, or what kind of money was lost? So when you have a reparation suit, it's not just hey to relocate us, right, or for health bills, but this idea of continuous loss of non-human elements that need to be accounted for, right? And of course, that's in legal and economic terms, but then that really does come up against what rights does land have. That was a lot of little pieces. Thank you for the questions.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I'm going to invite everybody to either come up here and check out this amazing artwork or join us across the hall for a reception.
Sorry for the technology issue.